Late at night, Sarah, a nurse with a haunting past, stumbles upon room 303, a hospital room that doesn't exist. Inside, a shadowy figure lies waiting, whispering secrets only Sarah could know. As the walls seem to close in and the lights flicker, Sarah realizes this is no ordinary room. It's a gateway to something far darker. The deeper she ventures, the harder it becomes to escape the chilling grip of 303. What's inside this room, and why does it seem to know her every fear? Step inside, if you dare. Sarah, a compassionate but overworked nurse, had always prided herself on being the kind of person who never left a patient behind. That was before the accident, before the young child she had been unable to save. Her patient had been in critical condition, but Sarah had been distracted. A routine error in judgment had led to a series of complications, and the child died in her arms. The guilt gnawed at her constantly, and though she tried to move on, the shadows of her past were always close. At the hospital, Sarah was a fixture, the one person who would always show up, no matter the hour. Her colleagues were often absent, leaving her to cover shifts that stretched into the early morning hours. Her exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was becoming more than just a nuisance. It was a constant weight on her shoulders, making her vulnerable to the terror that was waiting in the corners of the hospital, most notably room 303. Room 303 was nothing like any other room in the hospital. It had no records, no history. The patient there had been in a coma for years, with no name, no family, and no visitors. The staff was uneasy around the room, but no one could explain why. The patient, an elderly figure lying motionless in the bed, was an enigma to them all. But to Sarah, it was more than just a mystery. The whispers that came from the room, soft, almost inaudible, like the sound of breath in the dark, began to haunt her from the moment she first walked past the door. As Sarah started to investigate, she discovered the horrifying truth. The patient wasn't merely comatose, he was a vessel for something far darker, a malevolent entity that had been imprisoned for centuries. And now, Sarah was the key to its release. Once a thriving medical institution, the hospital was now a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Located on the outskirts of town, far from the bustling city center, it was a place that had fallen into decay, forgotten by most. The winds howled outside, rattling the windows as a storm brewed in the distance, casting eerie shadows across the aging building. The structure was vast, its long corridors stretching out in every direction, many of them now empty and unused. The few remaining patients were scattered across the different wings, their rooms cold and sterile. The scent of antiseptic mixed with the unmistakable odor of mildew, an unholy combination that lingered in the stale air. The fluorescent lights flickered constantly, casting brief moments of darkness between the harsh, clinical light. The faint hum of broken machinery echoed in the hallways, an unsettling reminder that the hospital was still alive in some way, but it was a life that had long since lost its purpose. The hospital seemed to breathe with a life of its own, whispering secrets in the dark. The flickering lights created an eerie, erratic rhythm. One moment, the hallway was bathed in sharp, sterile light, and the next, it was plunged into an oppressive darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional drip of water leaking through the ceiling. Each step Sarah took echoed louder than it should, as if the very walls were listening to her every move. Room 303 was the heart of the hospital's eerie atmosphere. The door was a warped and weathered thing, its paint peeling like old skin. When Sarah first entered, the temperature dropped an unnatural chill that nipped at her skin, even through her thick jacket. The air smelled faintly of decayed flowers, like something had died and been left to rot. The bed was pristine, its sheets white and untouched, but the figure lying there was anything but. The patient's eyes were closed, his body unnaturally still, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Sarah's curiosity about room 303 grew with each passing night. It started as a whisper, barely audible, but it was enough to catch her attention. The soft, almost melodic murmurs seemed to come from behind the door, and though she told herself it was just the wind or her imagination, She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was trying to communicate with her. Every time she passed the door, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't until she tried to investigate that she realized the room was locked. And yet, when she pressed her ear to the door, the whispers would cease, only to resume the moment she backed away. At first, the strange occurrences were subtle. The lights flickered sporadically, casting long shadows in the darkened hallways. The temperature in certain rooms would drop without explanation, and the air grew thick, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then came the cold drafts that would sweep through the hallways, despite the lack of windows. Sarah's colleagues, once friendly and chatty, began to withdraw. They muttered about the room, avoiding it at all costs, and when they spoke of it, their eyes would widen with unease. One night, Nurse Emma, Sarah's closest companion during the grueling night shifts, was lured into room 303 by an unexplainable call for help. Emma had always scoffed at the whispers that plagued the hospital. "Just creaky old pipes," she said with a dismissive wave. But that night, her resolve wavered. Something in the air had shifted, a palpable unease that seemed to seep through the walls. When Sarah saw Emma standing outside room 303, her heart sank. Emma's hand hovered over the doorknob, her face pale, eyes wide, as if hearing something Sarah couldn't. "Emma, wait," Sarah called out, but her voice felt small, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the corridor. Emma turned briefly, her expression a mix of fear and curiosity. "I hear someone inside. They're asking for help," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before Sarah could respond, Emma opened the door and stepped into the room. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The door remained ajar, revealing only the eerie stillness of the room. Sarah approached cautiously, the hairs on her arms standing on end. "Emma?" she called, her voice quaking. There was no reply. When Sarah pushed the door fully open, she was met with an unsettling sight. The room was empty, save for the comatose patient lying as motionless as ever. The bed seemed untouched, the air unnaturally cold. Sarah's gaze dropped to the floor, where a single blood-stained bandage lay, a chilling marker of Emma's last known presence. Panic surged through her. She ran to the security office, desperate to find answers. But when she replayed the footage, all she saw was static. No Emma, no movement, no explanation. The unshakable dread took root, whispering a truth Sarah wasn't ready to face. Room 303 didn't just take people, it erased them. Desperation clawed at Sarah as she scoured the hospital's archives. Stacks of dusty files and yellowed papers lay strewn across the table under the dim, flickering light of the record room. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through folder after folder, each one meticulously organized, except for the one she sought. The patient in room 303 had no file. At first, Sarah thought she had made a mistake. Perhaps the file was misplaced or misfiled. But after hours of searching, her unease deepened. She questioned the on-duty receptionist, who frowned at the mention of room 303. "There's no patient there," the receptionist said, her voice tinged with confusion. "That room's been out of use for years." Determined, Sarah turned to the hospital's digital database. The system was old, prone to glitches, but it was her last hope. She typed in the room number. Her breath hitched when the screen displayed an error message. No records found. Her heart pounded as she dug deeper, pulling up the hospital's architectural blueprints. The digital layout appeared on the monitor, a maze of corridors and rooms. Her eyes locked onto the third floor, scanning the familiar layout of the ward. But where room 303 should have been, there was nothing but blank space. Disbelief twisted into dread. She printed out the blueprint and compared it to her hand-drawn map of the hospital's floors. The discrepancy was undeniable. Room 303 didn't exist, at least not on paper. And yet, she had walked its hallways, stood inside its walls, felt its suffocating atmosphere. The whispers came again, louder this time. They didn't just echo in her ears. They seemed to coil around her mind, dragging her into their sinister rhythm. "Sarah." The sound was unmistakable, a low, guttural call. It wasn't a figment of her imagination. It was real. Her hands clenched into fists as she stared at the blueprint, her mind racing. If room 303 wasn't part of the hospital, what was it? A forgotten wing? A forbidden space deliberately erased from the records? or something far darker, something beyond human understanding. As the whispers grew insistent, she felt the walls of the record room press closer. The smell of mildew thickened, and the faint sound of static buzzed in her ears. She turned sharply, half expecting to see someone standing behind her. But the room was empty, save for the oppressive silence that seemed to mock her. At that moment, Sarah knew she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Whatever room 303 was, it wasn't just a room. It was a doorway leading somewhere she wasn't sure she wanted to go. Yet, the whispers beckoned her, a chilling invitation she couldn't escape. Sarah could no longer ignore the pull of room 303. Sarah's heart raced as she stepped into room 303, clutching the flashlight that had become her only source of comfort. The air was icy, thicker than before, and carried the faint stench of something rotten. The patient lay still on the bed, his face obscured by shadows. Yet, there was something different. His presence felt more pronounced, as though the room itself pulsed with his energy. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The patient's chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths. Then, without warning, his eyes snapped open. They weren't human pale orbs that glowed faintly, reflecting Sarah's terror back at her. His cracked lips pulled into a grin that stretched too far, as if mocking the boundaries of a human face. "You came," the patient rasped, his voice layered with tones, some human, some unearthly. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The dim beam illuminated the walls, which now writhed like living flesh. The room shifted, growing impossibly large and dark, swallowing Sarah into its abyss. She turned to flee, but the doorway had vanished. Instead, she was surrounded by whispers that were no longer just sounds. They were screams, wails of despair, and pleas for salvation. Faces appeared in the darkness, twisted and pale, their hollow eyes fixed on her. "You shouldn't have come," one of them hissed, its skeletal hand reaching for her. The patient rose from the bed, his body contorted in unnatural angles. "You wanted the truth," he growled, his voice reverberating like a thunderclap. "Now you'll join them." Sarah screamed as the darkness surged forward, wrapping around her like a vice. The last thing she saw was the patient's grin, wide and consuming, as the whispers turned into deafening roars. With all her strength, Sarah fought to escape the nightmarish dimension, but the force that held her was too strong. The darkness had wrapped around her, suffocating, relentless, dragging her deeper into its abyss. Just when she thought she would be consumed, a blinding flash of light tore through the void, and she found herself stumbling into the hospital corridor, gasping for air. Her legs trembled beneath her as she staggered forward. Each step felt heavier, as though an invisible weight pressed down on her chest. The whispers had ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that was almost worse. The storm outside had subsided, leaving the sky unnaturally clear, the moon casting a cold silver light over the deserted parking lot. She paused, clutching the railing at the hospital's entrance. The night air felt wrong, too still, too sharp, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her hands shook as she glanced back at the building. The windows of room 303 glowed faintly, though she knew all the lights had been extinguished. Sarah's mind raced. What had she unleashed? The patient's chilling words echoed in her memory. "You wanted the truth. Now you'll join them." She glanced at her reflection in a rain puddle by her feet. Her pale face stared back, but her eyes, they weren't hers anymore. Flecks of pale light danced in her irises, faint but unmistakable. She bolted to her car, her every instinct screaming to flee. Yet as the engine roared to life, a dreadful realization gripped her. The whispers weren't gone, they had followed her. Faint at first, like static, they grew louder as she sped down the empty streets. They weren't random this time. They spoke her name. Back in her apartment, Sarah locked every door and window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her knees, her thoughts spiraling. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message. She hesitated before picking it up, dread pooling in her stomach. The screen displayed a single text: Room 303 never lets go. Her phone slipped from her hands as the whispers surged again, louder than ever, filling the room with a suffocating presence. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. She stood in the dimly lit bathroom, gripping the sink, her knuckles white with tension. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't right. Her eyes, once warm and alive, now seemed hollow. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the mirror, and froze. Her pupils were wrong. They had expanded, consuming the color of her irises, leaving only endless black voids. The sight sent a chill through her veins. She blinked rapidly, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the darkness stared back, unwavering. She stumbled back from the mirror, her heart pounding. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. They weren't coming from the room, they were coming from within her. "You're part of us now," a voice whispered, soft yet chillingly clear. Sarah clutched her head, her mind spiraling. Memories of the hospital, of the patient, of the horror she had witnessed, surged through her in vivid flashes. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers overlapped, a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak in unison and yet were distinctly separate. She collapsed onto the floor, trembling. The cold from room 303 had followed her, seeping into her very being. She wasn't just haunted by it. She was connected to it now, an extension of its power. The last thing she saw before the whispers consumed her completely was her phone lighting up with a notification. A message. "Welcome home, Sarah." She was no longer just Sarah. She was part of room 303 now, one of the many lost souls trapped in its walls, waiting for the next to fall.